I'm going to be teaching you the secret technique is the most powerful mixing technique that I can possibly teach you. This is more powerful than any EQ trick, any compression trick, any volume balance trick that I can possibly teach you. This is the sole reason, this technique, that I was able to outmaster $5 million mastering studios on one project. And ultimately, I got the gig even though I only had $4,000 worth of equipment at the time. In this episode, I'm going to teach you what the technique is, how to use it, why it's important, and then last, I'm going to show you the 4 ways to utilize this technique in your mixes and masters to get that industry standard professional result that you're looking for in your mixes and masters. So what is this technique that I'm talking about? And this technique is something known as framing. I want to break down initially just what is a frame and how we can use this. So the first point that I want to bring up is a frame is from what angle you're viewing something. So think of a camera, or if you're into photography or videography, right? You can use different lenses to look at a single thing. You can use different angles. You can looking from something from below will make something appear taller than it actually is in real life, versus from above, something will appear shorter, because that's how we as humans are used to seeing things, right? So using this angle or this framing, right? That's kind of the original definition of the term of just, okay, there's a frame, it's a window, right? I can only see so much through this frame. And what angle and power that you're looking through this frame as is going to impact what you're actually able to see and perceive. So one of my favorite examples of this is in cinema in general, right? Because they're masters at being able to frame something. Best example that I have is A New Hope. So Star Wars, A New Hope, very first Star Wars movie ever made. And you see the initial shot of the whole movie, this ship that you see. It's like flying through space, right? And it's being shot at with all these lasers. And the ship looks huge. And then it continues to go on, and then you see the ship that's attacking the original one. And that's the Empire, right? So we have the little rebellion ship first, which appears really big in the first shot. And so you immediately think, okay, this is like massive thing, right? The massive ship that's flying through space. But then all of a sudden you see the next one, and the Empire ship, and it just keeps going. And going and going, and you realize the magnitude of the Empire. And so this is a frame not only of just the physical looking at the ships that are flying by, and then the Empire ship just keeps going and going and going, as you recognize the magnitude of it, but you recognize it sets up the story itself of, okay, this little tiny rebellion, while they have some firepower, it's nothing in comparison to the Empire that's chasing the rebellion, trying to squash it out. So you see these, this David versus Goliath type situation that's happening inside of the very first moments of this movie, which is why it's so powerful as the initial frame of the movie. It would be way more powerful than if they had started with the next scene, which is following C-3PO and R2-D2 throughout the ship. They're just running around, lasers flying everywhere. That's not as compelling. While it's good as a frame of like, okay, why are these like robots running around being shot at, talking to each other, right? And for whatever reason, R2-D2 only talks in beeps and boops, and yet C-3PO can actually still understand him, right? It's kind of bizarre if you really think about it. We kind of take it for granted now, I think. But while that would probably hook people in to a certain extent, because it's kind of unique and interesting, and it's not as powerful as the ship frame. At every point in time during our lives, we're always viewing something through a frame of some sort. Taking this more hypothetically, right? Two people can look at the same picture. For example, there's these weird, I don't even know what they're called, but like the pictures where two people can see different things. And you ask one person what they see, and they say like, oh, I see a cat. And you ask the other person, they're saying, oh, I see an old man, right? Just due to like the colors and the way it basically mental frame you throw over the visual, you can then see something different based on your own experience, how you naturally look at things, etc. So we already have this natural sense of, I can look at something in different ways and think about it. There's actually a really cool, it's just coming to mind. So there's this really cool Chinese proverb, and I'm going to butcher it, but I'll try to do it somewhat justice here. But basically there's this kid, and he breaks his leg, and everyone's like, oh, like, I'm so sorry that, your son broke his leg. And then the army comes and says like, oh, we need to, take your son to go to war. But he's like, oh, well, he's lame. He can't walk because he broke his leg. And they're like, oh, okay. And then everyone's like, oh, it's such a great thing that he broke his leg, right? So viewing the same exact situation, the kid broke his leg, is viewed very differently throughout two different frames based on, oh, okay, he broke his leg and that sucks, versus he just avoided going to war and likely dying for his country. The way you view something is incredibly powerful of the meaning you associate with it. And another example of this is when I first got my first corporate job. So I was a project manager. Actually, well, I started as an analyst on a team doing accounting for financial investments. And so my job was to help implement new clients onto the system. But a lot of the communication that we had was all the way through email, right? We had a weekly call or whatever, but most of it was just through email, updates like what's happening with this account, like why is it showing more interest, etc. Whatever, doesn't matter. But the one thing that they were very insistent on teaching us as new employees of the corporate world was to assume good intentions versus assuming bad intentions. Because something through text or email, we've all had that experience of somebody sent us a text and it was a little bit short. And we're like, okay, well, is this person mad at me? This happens all the time with my wife and I because originally she would always like think I'm mad at her because I wouldn't ever leave any punctuation or very little punctuation in my texts, and I would never use emojis. The reason was because I had a flip phone and it took forever to have any sort of punctuation or emojis in the texts. And it took me, 6 minutes to text back because it was such a pain to, touch these buttons like 16 times for 3 words. You can assume a negative intention of, okay, they are mad at me because of whatever reason, XYZ. Or you could assume good intentions of they're just busy right now and they're not actually mad at me. They just, have something else going on. They're at their grocery store, they're in line, they just needed to text me back real fast. It's the same thing that, they were trying to teach us of if somebody sends you a short email or if, we could take it to be very negative for whatever reason if we chose to, and then get angry and then escalate the situation, versus we could assume good intentions of they're just trying to do their jobs the best way that they know how, and now we can serve them in this way. This is basically everything to do with a frame. So we choose to view something in a certain way, and we reveal different intentions and different meanings behind it. And so this is super powerful when we start to dive into music. So let's bring it back to music production, music mixing, mastering, all that stuff. So the first way that I want us to think about this is a forest. So if you can imagine a forest and you can dive a little bit deeper into the trees, right? So you're missing the forest for the trees, right? So that means we're so focused on the details, we miss the overall picture. So we're using this analogy, we go a little bit deeper. Now all of a sudden we can look at the needle of a tree, just a single needle. Suppose it's a evergreen forest and not deciduous. And then we can dive deeper into that single needle. We can see the water inside of it. And then we can look at a single cell from that needle. And then we can dive in even further and look inside of that cell and just look at the little protoplasm, the little swimming pool inside of that single cell. It changes our perspective of forest, tree, needle, cell, protoplasm. And then on the other side, you could do the exact opposite and zoom out. So we start with a forest, which is already, right? Pretty big. But then we look at the mountains that encapsulate that forest. And then we can zoom out even further and we can see the continent, and then we can see the earth, and then we can see the solar system that contains the earth. And then we back out one more time and we see the universe. And who knows what's beyond that. So why did I start with that when we're talking about music? Because music is very similar in a way where it's super, super deep if we really want it to be. We can go all the way down to the protoplasm level and we can go all the way up to the universe of that song. Because when we first start listening to music, think about it. We generally are only listening to the melody and the rhythm maybe, and maybe the lyrics. That's pretty much it. That's all we really think about music. Average listener, and that's all they're really understanding about the music. But then we learn a little bit more about music. We're exposed to, some people who are into music. And then all of a sudden we start listening to song structure and chord structure, potentially tempo changes, key changes, things like that. We start to like listen to more of the song and things that are happening inside of it from a more musical standpoint. And then say we learn guitar. And so we all of a sudden understand way more about music. And so we're listening to way more of like the intricacies of the relationships between different elements. So we're listening to the guitar, and we might follow certain bands because they have a really good guitarist. And that incentivizes us to think, oh man, I really like this band. And because of the guitarist, they're doing some really cool stuff. And I don't care what the drums are doing. I don't even care about the vocalist anymore. I don't care about the lyrical content. I just care about this guitar. Right. And so that's a completely different frame, right, that we're viewing this music through. Versus if you're a bassist, you're probably going to listen to the bass first. And so you're going to have a completely different frame on the same exact song. So the guitarist and the bassist can be listening to the same song, and the guitarist is saying, man, that guitarist is so good. It's perfect. I love this song. Versus the bassist is looking at that song and saying, this bass part is very boring. He could have made this more interesting, and I just don't like this song because of that. We're always biased towards our own instrument, at least initially. If you're struggling to get that industry standard quality for your mixes, then go ahead and check out my book, The Objective Mix. It teaches you the objective standards of how to get an industry standard quality mix. There's a link in the description if you are interested in that. Let's get back to the video. As we learn more, as we play in bands, we're used to playing with other people a little bit more, then we start to get this more overall perspective of, okay, now this is more than just my instrument, right? This is not a band for me just to show off of how good I am of a guitarist or a bassist. It's now I am contributing to the overall vision of what we're trying to create of this single piece of music that can move somebody, right? So we're then thinking about, okay, where does my part fit into this greater picture? And now I'm paying attention to the macro dynamics of the song, right? I don't have to play every single second of the song, because sometimes it's more powerful if I drop out here in order for the bridge or the chorus to hit harder when I come back in. Or you're thinking about the vocal melody in a brand new light, because you're thinking, okay, the vocal melody is doing this. If I'm playing lead guitar, I don't want to play, the same exact thing necessarily, but I want to do something that complements the vocal melody in this verse or this chorus. So then we learned how to mix. And then all of a sudden we have this whole new array of frames to look at something through. We start to listen to reverb and space in the mix. We listen to tonal decisions of how bright is this guitar or dark is this vocal. We listen to more of the dynamics, and we're trying to listen to the microdynamics, which is really hard for us because we're not used to listening to the detail orientedness of a transient versus a tail in a single note, and it's difficult to hear at first. We're listening to saturation and harmonics, how much tape emulation was used on this mix to add this character of saturation to this mix overall, or this master. And we just develop these different frames to view things through. And one of the key risks of doing this is we view it through tools. And I'm going to argue that that's not the best way to do this, because when I'm focused on EQ, I have multiple different goals in mind, frames, if you will, that I can benefit the song through. Most people are thinking about EQ in very singular dimensional, where in reality, EQ is at least 3-dimensional, if not 4 or 5-dimensional. By viewing our mix through specific tools, we're not doing our mix any favors. And likely we're getting too caught up in the weeds. We're missing the forest for the trees, or the needles, or the protoplasm inside of the cells of the needle, because we're so focused on these individual tools that we're using to mix. And so my whole point here is these are all irrelevant. These tools don't matter when it comes to mixing music. They are tools to accomplish a specific vision and certain frames that we should be viewing our music through. My goal of teaching mixing and mastering, and the goal of my book, for example, wasn't to teach people how to EQ their vocal necessarily. Well, that's, part of it. I encourage people to learn the different tools and how to use them. But the goal was really to get people to view their mixes from the correct perspective to be able to then mix better. the tagline of this is mix without pro gear or premium plugins, because it doesn't matter what gear you have. It doesn't matter if you're mixing on a cracked version of 2003 Cubase or if you're mixing with the latest and greatest Logic Pro 11. It doesn't matter, because it matters about the perspective of what you're trying to achieve with the tools that you're given. And if you're able to utilize even the basic tools in the right way, we're able to get professional, meaningful changes inside of our songs and mixes and masters, and ultimately have them compete against the best in the industry, because we know how to view our mixes correctly. So this is why I'm obsessed with finding frameworks when I'm actually communicating, teaching, mixing, and mastering. Because these frameworks, as the name would imply now, hopefully you have a different view of frames. And how that actually works inside of frameworks is that we build multiple frames on top of one another. So we have EQ as a single frame inside of, just say we're using tonal EQ to make our tracks better by themselves. And then we combine that with the next frame of, okay, now we're relating our EQ to other instruments. And so we're looking at frequencies, not just a single item and its EQ settings. And so we stack these frames on top of one another to ultimately be able to accomplish far more meaningful results without actually changing anything we're inherently doing. Because it's not about doing more in your mix. It's about doing the right things in the mix. Going back to the example of when we're in a band and we're just starting to learn how to play, we're kind of an immature musician, and I'm the guitarist or the bassist, whatever. I'm the bassist and I want to do cool things. Right? That's my main goal of being in the band. And so by wanting to do cool things, I'm going to make the overall project and the songs worse, because I'm trying to do things that don't actually have any meaningful impact to the song itself or the music or the band. And ultimately, I'm actually hindering the project overall, because I'm too focused on this one task, which is why so often we end up with mixes that are unbalanced, that are overcompressed, that are sonically not balanced well, that don't have a good volume balance, because we're so focused on singular items inside of the mix rather than the mix as a whole. And we just don't know how to view the mix as a whole in the right frames to be able to mix professionally. Okay. My goal is to build these frames on top of each other so you can learn the skills that you have, or learn the skills of the individual elements of the tools that we have at our disposal, and then combine that into a framework to then be able to utilize that tool to its furthest extent possible. So what are the most powerful frames that we can use in our mixes? There are 4 powerful, extremely powerful frames that we can view our mix through in order to get the best possible results. The first frame that I like to view my mix through is distance. So the first place that distance is going to impact it is the volume balance. So when I'm talking about viewing your mix in distance, is viewing your mix as a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. So I always view my mix in these 3 spaces at every single stage of the process. Because when I'm volume balancing, for example, I like to keep my main element, so my kick and my snare, most likely, up front inside of the mix. My vocals are probably going to sit right behind that, still in the front, but not, super close to me. And then most of my other main elements are going to go in the middle space. So my rhythm guitars, my lead guitars, my bass, my toms, maybe other elements that aren't necessarily in the foreground of the mix, but should be still relatively present. And then in the very back of the mix, I have my other elements, such as my pads, maybe some synths, ear candy type stuff, any sort of just Foley in my mixes. I don't know. So for example, if I have somebody crunching some leaves inside of my mix, it's probably going to go in the back. It's not really a main element. So viewing this mix in these 3 spaces, it all of a sudden makes our volume balance way easier, because I'm not just sitting there focused on okay, is my vocal the same level as my reference? And does this make sense anymore? It's really just, okay, where is it distance or depth wise inside of the mix? Is it in the right spot? Is it in front of my snare? If it's in front of my snare, it's probably too far forward. It needs to back up. So we just turn it down. That's it. It's very easy to view it that way. The next place that we view that impacts this depth is EQ. So anything that has a little bit more brightness to it is going to feel like it's more forward, versus anything that is a little bit darker, has a little less top end to it is going to be viewed as further back. So after my volume balance, I'm moving on to tonal EQ, for example. I'm still going to keep this frame in mind. I'm still going to be thinking about distance, and I'm going to be thinking about, okay, my vocal is a little bit dark. I would like it to be in the front of the mix, and so I'm going to crank that top end of the vocal just a little bit in order to bring it forward so that I can actually sense the closeness, the intimacy of that vocal, rather than just trying to think of, oh, what's going to make this vocal sound better? I'm just going to look at somebody else's, cheat sheet, and I'm going to just cut at 630, and I'm going to boost at 3K, just because that's what it told me to do. What if your vocal was already really harsh? And now you're all of a sudden making it more harsh, right? So that's the danger of just copying what other people are doing. But if you view it in this frame of what's closer, then you'll recognize, okay, this vocal actually might be too close. It's sounding like it's in front of my kick and my snare. And I already think that volume balance wise, it's in a good spot. And so I can maybe back off the 3K a little bit, because that's what's going to make it feel too close and very present. So it might actually be a good move to actually reduce the 3K, maybe even boost the 600 if I'm trying to push it back in the mix. For a harmony vocal, for example, a lot of my harmony vocals, I end up boosting in that mid-range somewhere, even though 99% of lead vocals are likely going to be cut in that area somewhere. My harmony vocals are often boosted there because I have different goals in mind because of this frame of distance. Because I still want those things to be present in terms of I want to be able to hear them and that they add some character to the mix, but I don't want my harmony vocals are going to be in that backspace. They're not going to be in the front. So I'm going to treat it differently with EQ with this frame in mind. The next area that distance is going to impact it is the compression. So compression, while this is the smallest lever in terms of creating depth in the mix, I'm still going to use it as a frame when I'm compressing things, such as my kick and my snare. My kick and my snare, I want them to feel very forward, but I also want them to be really powerful and thick and just fat. If those are my goals from my mix, then I'm going to use some thickness style compression. So fast attack, fast release, squishing down that transient a little bit just to thicken the whole signal up a little bit. But that's going to make those items feel inherently a little bit further away. So when I do that, I will likely also add some groovier, punchy style compression, anything with a longer attack that's going to emphasize that transient again. And those might seem like opposite goals for the element, and inherently it actually is. But if we are able to thicken up the signal, it's going to be more consistently thick, even if I am emphasizing later the transient of that element. I'm still going to keep, again, this distance frame in mind, and it's informing how I use all of my tools inside of my mix. And then obviously reverb is the last major tool in our mix that we're going to be utilizing to create distance inside of a mix. And I have plenty of videos and other tutorials on how to do that, so I don't want to really go in too depth, but the idea is that we're going to create reverb, what I refer to as the reverb depth matrix, to be able to create something that sounds close to us, a middle distance away, and then far away, in order to be able to create this, emphasize that amount of depth that I already have in my mix. Because when I was first starting to even teach other people how to mix, I utilized this same technique in my mixes, but yet I didn't know the frame behind it. And so I used it every single time, but sometimes it didn't work as well as I thought it should. And it was because I hadn't been intentional about the other steps prior to the reverb about creating depth. And so it's more powerful to chunk up to these bigger frames rather than focus on the minutia of what am I doing with this EQ or this compressor. The next frame that you should be using inside of your mixes, the second frame, is sonic balance. And so sonic balance, put simply, is the balancing of the frequencies in the mix. And we essentially want equal power of all the frequencies without over or underemphasizing any one frequency. So there's a little bit of give in here. And I like to use the objective standard of pink noise because it's very good, and between about 100 hertz and 5 kilohertz. Because anything above 5 kilohertz, if you actually match pink noise, it's going to be too bright, it's going to be too harsh, and generally kind of end up in a little bit less of a smooth sound, and a little bit too harsh and tinny sounding. But in that mid-range, right, it's very important for us to maintain some semblance of this pink noise balance, because that's an equal power of every single octave inside of the mix. That's what pink noise, the definition of pink noise is. So using that definition and using pink noise as the objective standard, we can all of a sudden get far better mixes because our mid-range is going to be better balanced. And this is one of the reasons, this is probably the core reason why your mix doesn't translate to the car or other systems, is because maybe you have a little bit too much 250 hertz and not enough 500 hertz, and that's going to translate great to certain systems and really bad to other systems based on its own individual characteristics, the room you're listening in, the car you're in, the speakers that are producing the sound, etc. And so the best way to get your mix to translate really well is through that frame of sonic balance, making sure that each frequency is equally represented inside of the mix. It's not the only thing that helps translation issues, but it probably is the most powerful. And so often when we're talking about a mix being too dark or too bright, this is the frame that we're actually talking about. But generally, we don't really understand how to back up into that frame properly to be able to view our mix. So if you're trying to get the sonic balance in your mix, pull up pink noise, pull up an analyzer, look at that pink noise, make sure you're using average volume, so RMS, with your analyzer as well, because that's what we're hearing as humans. We hear average volume, not peak volume. So make sure you have that in your analyzer. You look at what your pink noise looks like, and then look at your mix and see the differences. There should be a drop off in the ultra lows and also the highs. Anything above 5K you should have a decent drop off. But between those 2 points, so between 100 hertz and 5 kilohertz, should be relatively equal to pink noise. And if it's not, just try throwing on an EQ on your mix bus and shifting it so it's more closer, it matches pink noise better. And I think you're going to be really surprised by how much more professional your mix sounds and how much better it translates to other systems. Granted, there's usually deeper issues. If you don't have a very good sonic balance, you need to revisit your volume balance or your EQ, or even sometimes your effects inside of your mix to be able to get that sonic balance to match properly. Again, this frame impacts every single step that you're taking inside of your mix, not just the final mix bus EQ that you're doing. Okay, so the third frame that you should be viewing your mix through is dynamic. This is a little bit more common, of people kind of get this, but there's 2 different frames within this greater frame of dynamics that you need to pay attention to. So the first one is macro dynamics. So macro dynamics is anything from the note level or bigger. So thinking about our tree versus our forest versus our continent, right? That's kind of what we're looking at from the macro viewpoint. The micro viewpoint is looking at the needle or the tree or the protoplasm inside of the cell, right? Okay, so I think I said that analogy wrong, but I think you get the point. Micro is looking at each individual note and the difference between the loudest part of the note and the quietest part of the note. And so we can adjust that. We can create additional micro dynamics using compression. Because if I'm making my transient, so the first part of the note, louder and the tail quieter, I am all of a sudden inherently increasing the micro dynamics of that track. That same move might decrease the macro dynamics at the same time. So you have to be cognizant of not only the macro viewpoint of dynamics, but also the micro viewpoint of dynamics, and also how they relate to one another. And so, which is why I have a 5-step process for creating dynamics inside of a mix and creating good dynamics inside of a mix, because sometimes you need to reduce the macro dynamics, increase the micro dynamics, or vice versa. And there's a way and a tool and a process to do that most effectively, which I am planning on covering in a future episode. So just keep listening if you want to get that episode. It may or may not be out by the time you're watching or listening to this. Dynamic balance in a nutshell, though, we want to make sure that there's movement overall in the whole song, so section to section, versus the interplay between various elements, because that's going to impact the dynamics. So if I have a very loud snare and a very quiet guitar, and those are the only 2 things in the mix, then I can actually increase the dynamics simply by turning up the snare, because the snare is that peak essentially of the mix and the guitar is that average volume, and the difference between the two is essentially the amount of dynamics you have in your mix. Even if they're both just squashed and compressed beyond recognition, you could still technically have decent, macro dynamics inside of the song by automating the volume afterwards and also having this better volume relationship between the two elements. So again, these frames is meant to look at from a holistic standpoint and make sure that you're treating them appropriately and capturing every element of dynamics inside of your song, because sometimes you might have nailed the macro dynamics. There's nice movement in the song. You did a great job with volume automation. So there's movement and there's good transitions and everything feels like it's good, right? Versus the micro dynamics may be off a little bit because we're losing some words with your vocal, or there's weird notes that are cropping up through your bass guitar, or one chord of your guitar sounds really loud comparatively to another one. So like those are all elements of dynamics, even if our macro dynamics is good. Your macro dynamics are good, but your kick isn't punchy enough, right? So your kick it sounds kind of flat. And that's a microdynamic issue, not a macrodynamic issue. Okay. So the last frame that you should be viewing things through is clarity. So clarity is probably one of the hardest ones to think about and kind of back up and really understand from a high level. But essentially, clarity is just being able to hear each element clearly inside of the mix. That's the simple definition of clarity. The difficult part is being able to create this in the mix, because there's, again, just like all these other ones that we've talked about, all of these same tools, the EQ, the volume balance, and the compression, and the reverb, and any other effects you use, are going to impact the clarity of your mix. And so usually when we're talking about clarity, 90% of the time we're talking about either the volume balance or the EQ, generally the EQ. Because EQ is going to be able to build positive relationships between the various elements in your mix by reducing masking. And masking, if you're not sure what masking is, or you need a refresher, masking is where two elements exist in the same frequency range, and instead of being able to hear each of them, you hear them combined, they mix together, and you can't actually hear either element inside of the mix. This happens all the time with electric guitars and their corresponding lead guitar inside of the mix, because both of these elements are very thick in nature. They exist in a lot of different spaces in the frequency spectrum, and lead guitars on the top end generally aren't higher than a rhythm guitar because these harmonics are so thick that generally they're still, dipping off around 4 to 5K at the most. And so they exist in this mid-range solely. Regardless of how high you're playing on the neck, it's still going to exist somewhat in this mid-range. And so your rhythm guitar can very easily just mask completely your lead guitars. And so then we end up turning up our lead guitars to get them to stand out. And then our lead guitars are too loud and they're not present in the mix, or rather and then our rhythm guitars don't sound present in the mix because the lead guitar is so much louder. And then we end up with just this back and forth of endless tweaking in our mix, because we turn up the lead guitar, then we turn up the rhythm guitars, and then all of a sudden our drums are now too quiet. And so we have to turn up our drums, and we just end up in this cycle of just endless tweaking of volume and just trying to add a little bit of EQ here, a little of EQ there, without any sort of path to be able to get to clarity inside of our mix. So clarity essentially is just trying to reduce masking between elements. That's all it is. And inherently, I like to use the analogy of we have a box and we have a whole bunch of stuffed animals that we need to fit in the box. And inherently, the stuffed animals, as they are sitting right now, are too big to fit in the box. And so we need to compress them, and we need to squish them, and we need to move them into weird shapes to be able to get them to fit inside of that box. That's the process of not only volume balancing, of which elements do I put in the box first. I should probably put the biggest elements, the biggest stuffed animals inside of the box first in order for them to all fit correctly. And then I also need to be able to use some compression to compress those elements so they fit in the box. And then I also need to move them around, so maybe the giant dinosaur stuffed animal is going to fit best in the corner of the mix, and I need to kind of like move its tail in this weird way in order to fit the seal that's also needs to go inside of the box. So with that in mind, we can use EQ to reduce these masking between these elements because inherently there's not that much room in a mix. So that's the analogy of the box, is that there's not enough room inside of the mix to fit everything that we want to. And so we have to sacrifice certain frequency ranges of elements to be able to fit inside the box. The great thing about this, though, is that humans don't generally notice when there's things missing if we can hear the right things inside of the mix. So if we can hear several different points of, say, electric guitar inside of a mix, then we can just understand intuitively what should belong between those 2 points. And this is a concept known as Gestalt. It's very well studied. You can look it up. But with that frame of clarity, we're just reducing masking. That's the only goal. But we're still trying to increase the positive relationships with all the other tools as well. So tonal EQ, with our compression, with our obviously relational EQ, and even our reverb and effects, we're still working on building this clarity, because what happens if I have a great mix and then I start adding some delays to it? That's like adding another element. That's adding some more stuff to put in the box. And I now need to find a new place to fit that in the box where it's also not going to exist in the same spot as another stuffed animal inside of my box. So anyway, that is clarity in a nutshell. I'll probably create some more content around that specifically as well. But I'm really hopeful that this has opened your eyes on exactly how to view your mixes and why framing is so powerful when it comes to mixing. It's not about the tools we're using. It's about the goals of those tools and how to utilize them to achieve those particular goals in the mix. And as you'll notice, it's challenging because we need to have all 4 of those frames in mind at the same time when we are doing, say, our tonal EQ or our volume balance. Because our tonal EQ, if I boost the top end, it might be more clear in the mix, but it's also bringing the element forward, and that may or may not be a good thing. It's probably a great thing for our lead vocal, but it's probably not a great thing for our harmony vocals. So we need to find a different place that's going to serve both purposes better inside of our mix. Then you're probably already producing and mixing your own music. And if you're unable to get that professional sheen or quality or vibe for your songs, then I want to let you in on a little secret. Most mixers are trying to compensate their lack of professional mixes by getting more plugins, by using more advanced tips or tricks or techniques in their mixes, or relying on buying more professional gear in order to compensate for their lack of quality mixes. But in reality, most mixers' core problem is actually mixing subjectively, or approaching mixing from just a creative mindset entirely. Obviously, mixing is still a somewhat of a creative skill. It's actually far more objective than most people realize. Because if we think about it, everyone agrees on what a professional mix actually is. If that weren't the case, then it would be an entirely subjective field. But in reality, mixing is actually incredibly objective because everyone agrees on what a pro song sounds like. And so mixing objectively can actually help you avoid being your own worst enemy inside of your mixes, and ultimately allow you to just check all of the boxes that a professional mix should check, and then your mix will sound objectively professional. And so if you're mixing your own music and you're motivated to actually learn the objective skill of mixing, and if you want to ensure that your music sounds pro, then I would love to help you out by teaching you the 5 objective standards that everybody is judging your mix by, and how you can use objective mixing to solve those 5 problems inside of your mix, and then also how to do all of that in under 3 hours per song without pro gear, premium plugins, or utilizing templates or presets. So if this is something that piques your interest, then go to theobjectivemix.com to order my brand new book, The Objective Mix. This will teach you how to mix objectively professional mixes every single time you sit down to mix. This provides you with my entire mixing workflow, along with all of the breakthrough lessons that I've learned in the last 16 years of mixing music. So if that is interesting to you at all, then again, go to theobjectivemix.com or click the link right below this video. Can't wait to see you on the inside.